Hello, and welcome to our series on reimagining teaching and learning. I'm your host, Chris Sessoms, Director of Academic Affairs at D2L, also known as Desire to Learn, the creators of the Brightspace Learning Platform. Today, we're going to explore why technology alone cannot transform education with my guest, researcher and learning scientist, Dr. Justin Reich, author of the new book, Failure to Disrupt. Justin is the Mitsui Career Development Professor of Comparative Media Studies and Director of the Teaching Systems Lab at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But before we do, allow me to go over some quick housekeeping items to get us started. Today, this session is scheduled for 1 hour, and Justin and I will get the conversation started and take a break for questions from the audience about every 10 minutes or so. So you can pose a question anytime in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. So don't be shy. This is an opportunity to ask anything about Justin's book, his research, or teaching and learning online, so on. And this session is being recorded and will be available for you to watch and rewatch and share shortly after we wrap. There's also closed captioning available in the session recording, so that will be available to you as well. All right. I think we got the housekeeping out of the way, and I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Today, I have the great fortune to speak with Justin Reich. Justin is a learning scientist, as I mentioned, interested in learning at scale. He's a practice-based teacher education and the future of learning in a networked world. He is an assistant professor of comparative media studies and writing at the department, he is the professor of assistant professor in the Comparative Media Studies Writing Department at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the director of the MIT Systems Lab, which designs, implements, and researches the future of teacher learning. We should probably take a drink of water. He is the instructor of 5 free openly licensed MOOCs about change leadership in education. And he is the author, as I mentioned, of Failure to Disrupt, Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education, now available at Harvard University Press and on Amazon. He is also the host of Teach Lab podcast. And he was previously the Richard L. Menschel HarvardX Research Fellow, where he led the initiative to study large-scale open online learning through HarvardX and a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is an alumni and a faculty associate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and his writings have appeared in Science, The Atlantic, Educational Researcher, The Washington Post, Inside Higher Ed, and much more. For several years, he wrote the Edtech researcher blog at Education Week, and Justin started his career teaching wilderness medicine and later taught high school world history and history electives and coached wrestling and outdoor activities. Welcome, Justin. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Now, as much as I want to dig into your career as a wilderness medicine instructor, today I want to specifically dig into your excellent new book, Failure to Disrupt. So I'm going to start with a pretty easy open-ended question, and then we'll work our way through these. So if you could, tell us a little bit, what is or has been the role of technology in education, and what is educational technology good for? What is it good at?
That is a great question, and I wish it had a more pat answer. I think actually one of the challenges we've had over the last 2 decades is that education technology evangelists have promised that new technologies could play a disruptive, transformative role in education, that they could create new kinds of systems that sort of sweep away the past and lead to a glorious new millennia of technology-rich education. But as my colleague Mimi Ito at UC Irvine framed it, a better way to think of technology is that technology gets domesticated by existing systems. Education technology slots in to particular niches that serve some students in some places in some contexts. And so the role of technology in education, largely has been supportive. It largely, in K-12 classrooms, in most college settings, the role of technology has largely been to supplement and make somewhat more efficient the traditional practices of teachers. There are some places, again, niches rather than whole fields or whole systems where technology has created some pretty different relationships between teachers and students. The long incremental rise of online learning over the last 30 years, which is connected to an even longer period of rise of distance education that kind of comes out of World War I and World War II. Those things have been steadily growing for decades now, and they look really different than dropping a few iPads into a classroom. But I think in most cases, the best way to think about the role of technology is, overwhelmingly, it's a supplement that helps teachers do the kinds of things they were doing before a little bit more efficiently, except in a small handful of very interesting, but unfortunately usually not very widely scaled places where it starts, doing different kinds of things. And then, the question of what is technology good at? Probably the best way to start answering that question is that different technologies are good at different things in different subject areas for different groups of people. We have some really cool automated assessments that can evaluate whether or not you're pronouncing a word in a foreign language correctly. That is a pretty cool feat of recording technologies and distance communication technologies and machine learning and other kinds of things. We don't have very good technologies that can detect whether or not you can read a few chapters of Cervantes' Don Quixote and make any reasonable sense of it. And so, if you were to talk about, even if you were to make the question more narrow, what is education technology good for in language learning? You would come up with a bunch of sort of specific kinds of answers particular to language learning. Well, it's pretty good at connecting people over Skype or other things for live communication and live language practice with people who are in other places. It's good giving you access to foreign media so you can listen to media in different languages. We have these cool assessments that can evaluate your pronunciation, and that, and other kinds of tools like that power Duolingo and other things that are good at, self-paced introductory language learning in certain kinds of topics. But all of the answers that we would come up with for the field of language learning, they would be different for the field of computer science, and they would be different for math, and they would be different for social studies, and they'd be different from kindergartners to teaching people in college or in the workforce. So that's the sort of challenge of trying to write about education technology, is that there are a bunch of education technology evangelists who in the popular imagination want to describe education technology as a sweeping reform, as a sort of bulldozer that kind of changes everything. But it's really better think of it as like a bunch of very specific tools, like particular pegs that fit in a complex matrix of holes of all different shapes and sizes.
That makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. So let me ask you then, should educational technologies try to replicate conventional educational models, or should they be looking beyond?
So the question that you asked there, I try to answer in a chapter in the book about what I call the curse of the familiar. So a thing that we know for sure from education research is that when we give teachers new technologies, they initially use them to extend existing practices. That is the most common thing, and we've known this for 40 years now, at least. Judith Sandholz was a researcher who led a project in the 1980s called the Apple Classrooms of Tomorrow project, where they had these Apple II Plus computers that were wired to each other in the first wired classrooms and had HyperCard software and things that probably people of our age remember from our childhoods. She found that teachers very, very rarely did amazing things with these new technologies off the bat. They almost all had to go through a developmental process. Virtually every instructor in the world right now is in the midst of going through this developmental process during the pandemic, where they're suddenly forced to take on new technologies. And the default thing to do with new technologies is to extend existing practices. And then a smaller number of people who either by inclination or by their context or because they go through this developmental process long enough, start inventing practices that look really new and different. So what does this mean for a technology developer? Well, one thing that you can do is that you can build technologies that extend existing practices. Maybe the most widely used piece of education technology in the world is a piece of software called Quizlet. It was developed by a wonderful guy, Andrew Sutherland, who was an MIT dropout. He left to pursue his dream of creating Quizlet. And Quizlet generates online flashcards. And lets you practice and share online flashcards. If we got a bunch of education experts around the world together and said, there are vast inequalities and the future is a transforming and scary place, like what do we really need to prepare our young people for the decades ahead? I don't think very many of them would answer, we need next generation flashcards. I don't think people would say like, oh, our system has a real dearth of flashcards and that's really the challenge that we're up against. But because Andrew built something which was instantly familiar to anyone who uses it, it's spread quite widely and it's useful. But also it basically sustains the same kinds of practices that we have in school, and it's probably in a lot of ways not really that much better than just having a deck of index cards lying around that you write on. So that's one side of the curse of the familiar. If you create things that are familiar, you can get them adopted, but they are unlikely to lead to substantial change and therefore substantial improvement in schools. The other thing that you can try is to build things that are really new, that create new kinds of learning experiences, that reimagine the classroom, that create new kinds of curriculum, new tasks, new relationships between teachers and students. Oftentimes, when technologists build those kinds of learning environments, teachers and students find them confusing. If you create something that people don't already know how to do, it's very difficult to create that in a way that's intuitive and invites people into those kinds of new experiences. So then what we find is that they sort of languish, they don't get adopted, they get adopted only in particular places and particular times by small communities. So that is a challenge that really most education technology products have not sorted out. There are like two pretty clear answers to the question, and neither of the, if you're really trying to improve education, if you're trying to, make more and new kinds of learning, if you're trying to close educational opportunity gaps, I've got two disappointing answers for you. And the only, I don't think we have a lot of examples of organizations that have sort of threaded the path between those two things, but to the extent that we have, they tend to do two kinds of things. And this is really, the first of these is really important to the theme of the whole book. Organizations that create technologies that lead to new and better kinds of practices, they don't just sell technologies, they engage educators in conversations, in practices around pedagogy with new technologies. So they don't see technology as a switch that you flip on and on. They see it as a set of tools that's embedded in a set of practices and practices that need to be rehearsed and improved. And then the second thing, which I think they can think about, is they create technologies which have entry points that are very familiar and pathways to do really different kinds of things. So you can say, come in here and we're going to do some things that look really familiar and normal to you. But once you become part of this community and learn more about what we're doing and see all the possibilities that are here, you're going to be really excited about branching off and doing new kinds of things. So there's a lot that I sort of unpacked in that simple question that you have there. But it's about the curse of the familiar, and the way through the curse of the familiar is really about building communities, not just building tools.
I love the way you frame that. And on a similar line, so another question I had was, in what ways can we best measure the impacts of these new technologies on teaching and learning? Are conventional metrics good enough, or should we be looking elsewhere?
Yeah, I would say one of the huge challenges with measuring learning, and measurement is a theme that sort of cuts throughout the book in various ways, but probably the main risk here is that technologies often natively collect lots of behavioral measures, which are not very good indicators of learning, or not very rich and sophisticated indicators of learning. I mean, after about a year of working at HarvardX, one of my lines was, you can have terabytes of data that do not answer any interesting questions. You can know a lot about things that don't really help you. So in fact, one of the biggest problems we have in learning technology research, learning analytics, is that we don't use conventional measures enough. We use these newfangled behavioral measures of click count, of view count, of number of logins, persistence, things like that. When what we really want to know is, what was a person's level of performance or understanding before we started hanging out with them, and how has it changed since then? In particular, how can they, have they seen changes in their behavior, their proficiency, not just within the learning technology platform, but in the real world where we actually want them to get better and do things? This is a challenge that we're tackling quite a bit in the online courses that we build in our lab. I'm not just an education technology critic, but I'm also a client, and I'm also a builder. And when we think about answering the question, how are our open online courses changing teacher behavior? We count some things like logins and the certificates that we award and persistence and things like that, because those give us some initial baselines into things. We've put a lot of work into building digital clinical simulations that have people acting in ways that we think are going to be able to give us some indication about how people are thinking and how they might perform in the future. But then we're doing lots of different kinds of work, like interviews, like surveys, like classroom observations, like collection of authentic sort of professional behavior after the course, to see whether or not we're actually making a difference in people's lives. So I think the problems with learning technologies is less that we, need lots of brand new kinds of measures. It's more that we need to do a better job of not just measuring things that are easy in the data that happen to be lying around, but in measuring the things that actually matter for our learners. Can they actually do things or understand things in new kinds of ways in authentic settings far beyond our learning platforms?
That makes a lot of sense. I'm glad to hear that. We're going to go to questions from our participants in just a couple minutes. So if you have a question or two, please use the Q&A forum to post those. So that way I can find them pretty quickly. And we'll turn to those, as I said, in just a couple minutes here. But before we do, Justin, I got another question for you. In selecting educational technologies, are there specific kinds of questions that schools or universities should be asking?
Yes, absolutely. We should be critical consumers of what we buy. I think that, one conventional set of ways to answer this is, what is it? Start with the question of, how do you want your students to be different? Can you articulate what kinds of learning experiences you are not effectively generating right now that you'd like to be able to effectively generate? And what will it look like when students are being successful in those environments? Can you articulate those things really clearly? And then think about what kinds of technologies would help get you there. It's, I feel like, I've worked with schools and universities as a consultant, helping them with technology adoptions for 15 years or whatever it is. And what's I think a kind of crazy challenge is that these decisions just take up so much of, there's so many logistics involved that they take up so much of the thinking part of your brain. Like, you find people just being attracted to questions like, well, how long will the batteries last? And will it interface with my student information system? And how do you auto generate your passwords? And is it compliant with this, that, or the other thing? And, it's like, no, stop. You have to think about those questions at some point, but stop and go back and say, what are the learning goals you have for your students? And is this thing going to actually help you meet it? Now, a big part of my book, I think, is particularly targeting K-12 institutions and universities. When someone is coming to them and saying, hey, I've got something brand new here. I've got something that's really potentially going to be transformative to your schools, and you should think about making a big investment to that. And I have a lot of questions in the book that I think you should ask about people making those kinds of claims. But the first question is, what's new? What's really new here about this thing that you've developed? And, my experience is that almost any new piece of software or tool or platform that you can find, when you look at it, you will find that it's not all that new. Like, maybe the sort of hood is new, but you pull up the hood and look at the chassis and you're like, oh, we've been working on that thing for decades now in the field of education technology. In fact, I say that there are basically 3 genres of large-scale learning technologies. There are, and the key question to ask to get at those genres are, who is in control or who sets the sequence of learning activities for a student? There are instructor-guided learning at scales technologies like massive open online courses where a teacher or a team sort of sets the path of things. There are algorithm-guided learning at scale technologies in which a student does some kind of work and the computer evaluates that work and picks different kinds of challenges based on that computational evaluation. And then there are peer-guided learning environments where a community of peers creates a series of pathways or a network of learning experiences for people to go through. And all of those technologies, those three genres, they have pedagogies associated with them. They have technologies associated with them. They have a long history. We have research literatures which tell us, on average, what kind of efficacy or what kind of interactions can we expect with each of these kinds of things. And so with almost any new tool, really the thing to do is to say, like, what is this thing most like? And what does the research say? Not the sort of case studies that the education technology salesperson puts in front of me, but that the research literature has to say about what happens typically in schools that adopt these kinds of things. There's more questions that are in the book, but that's a good sort of starting set of them.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Justin. We're going to go to questions, and I'm going to start with Joseph Kennedy asks, how can we move higher education to a reform that allows for things which are taught well through synchronous technology to be taught in such a manner so that faculty and students together time is spent on things technology does not do well? It seems that Carnegie units and seat time are huge barriers. Oh, amen, brother. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I hear Joseph asking, one of the ways I would frame Joseph's question is, there is virtually nothing we do more expensive in education than spend our time together. It is just enormously expensive to hire people, to have people travel all over the world, to build buildings so that we can live and study near one another. So what are we going to do with this very precious time we have together? And how can we find the things that students can learn reasonably well on their own? I think that's a great set of questions to ask in any circumstances. I think there are some fields. The problem becomes the answer to your question is specific to your field. So you would say, well, let's get rid of Carnegie units and seat time. Let's just see whether or not people are proficient at tasks. One group of educators that has done a pretty good job of that is medical education. So medical education, they say things like, you want to be a paramedic? You got to intubate 3 people. You're gonna have to sit in the back of a rig, and you can live in rural Vermont and take a year and a half to intubate 3 people, or you can go to New York City and you can intubate 3 people in a night. We don't care how long it takes, you just have to intubate 3 people. But one of the reasons why that performance task works is because there is, universal agreement on what a successful intubation looks like. Your air is passing from the external world into that person's lungs despite an obstruction and back out. We know exactly what that looks like. In teacher education, we don't have the same sort of, obvious criteria that a particular teaching move has worked for a particular student in a particular context. It's a lot, you can check people off for certain kinds of things, but it's a lot harder to develop those kinds of automated assessments. I think the other problem towards shifting to more sort of competency-based, asynchronous kinds of methods is that lots of people don't like learning that way. There are, as far as we can tell, it certainly seems like there are relatively few people, or many people, if you ask them to study something that they're not really passionate and interested in, will really struggle to make it through a sort of formally structured course of materials on their own without a lot of external supports. And the people who are good at doing that, they tend to be people who have an apprenticeship in the formal education system. So they tend to be people who are already educated and already affluent already. I have been incredibly struck during the pandemic. Last March, which was 400 years ago now. But you may remember we sent all of the students home, and there are dozens of introductory microeconomics professors all around the world who are I'm not gonna be able to lecture from lecture hall anymore. I'm gonna have to go to my home office with some crappy webcam and make my own personal online course for my students. mean, the crazy, like, it's going to be bad. A lot of these learning experiences are going to be bad because teachers don't know how to do these things. That's fine. Now, it turns out that a whole bunch of companies, edX, Coursera, FutureLearn, other things like that, have spent, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars with their university partners building introductory microeconomics courses. I thought that we were going to see in March and April and May is a bunch of faculty saying, hey, go take that course, go take that course, which has already been built and people have spent $100,000, and then come to my class and we'll do a recitation and I'll sort of help you with it. But it's not what teachers did. And as far as I can tell, it's also not what students wanted. What students wanted was their hastily pandemic assembled, crappy webcammed introductory microeconomics class from their professor at Walla Walla State or wherever else it was. Because it turns out that for all of those faults and all of those challenges, even at a distance, students more or less wanted to be in rooms, in this case, virtual rooms together, learning at the same time from a human being that they know. And those things are really, really important to people. So I think as much as, we can sort of theoretically imagine, like, imagine this system where we create all these online resources and people move through them at their own pace and get support in classes and things like that. It turns out that it's not what people want for the most part, and a lot of them are not very good at it. Not because they're bad people or not smart, but because it turns out that independent self-paced learning is really, really hard.
That's a very good point. I'm going to take one other question from the audience right now, but we will come back to those, I promise. If we haven't gotten to yours, I will do my best to get to it this afternoon while we've got Justin on the line. I'm going to go to the next one in the queue. This is from Julie Allen. Justin, and she's asking, what's your favorite generic tool for all teachers? And I'd love to leave this session with a new tool that I can utilize. So,
yeah, I'm not the best person to answer that question because it immediately makes me want to ask, like, well, what are you teaching, and who are your students, and what are your goals, and what do you feel like are not working well? And so there are definitely technology tools that I enjoy. I mean, the thing that I'm enjoying the most right now in the courses that I'm teaching at MIT is we're starting some of our class session in Zoom, asking everyone to type a short response into the chat window, but not hit send. And then we all hit send at the same time and we all read it. So we start the beginning of the session with like a little bit of quiet reflection time. Then everybody gets to write something. You have no advantage of being faster because we're all going to hit send at the same time. And then we get to start class just seeing like what everybody's thinking, kind of bringing into this. And, as an instructor, there's also a little bit of an accountability mechanism based in there. It's hard, if you have nothing to say about the topic, you're going to be a little bit stumped there. And that's just like a little lame crapo chat text window in the side of this other complex tool. But that's been fun for me to play around with that and have people think about some of that. I mean, it actually harkens back to when I was a teacher in 2003. I taught high school world history in a one-to-one classroom with these orange and blue clamshell MacBooks. We were certainly not the first, but we're relatively early on to have a kind of full networked one-to-one environment. And one of the things that I started doing is in class, I would break my students up into groups of 3 and have them have chat-based conversations. This is like around the time sort of AI messengers getting big and common amongst teens and stuff like that. So they sort of really liked the idea of chatting. It was unlike a verbal conversation, like everybody could talk at the same time and everybody could kind of read and listen at the same time. And I had a printed transcript of everyone's conversation. And so afterwards, I could read through all of them quickly and say, hey, this group is doing a really good job supporting their assertions with evidence. You all might want to look at this one and see sort of what kinds of things that they brought in. And then, once a semester, there'd be some reason, a conference or something that I would have to be gone. And I would just assign them into their groups to chat for the whole period, and bring in an assistant principal or something like that to supervise the class. And my freshmen loved it. They loved typing on the computers. They loved talking with one another. I remember distinctly the first year I did it, I told them they had to do it for 20 minutes and they could go. And the assistant principal told me when I came back, they just sat there and typed with each other for the whole 45 minutes. And again, it was another like crappy piece of text messaging software that was built into first class. So it's really, I'm not, there are cool tools out there. But I think the questions are like, what are you trying to have people learn and be able to do? And what's the simplest possible tool that will enable you to be able to do that?
I like that. Keeping it simple has always been my rule of thumb, and you just reified that. Thank you. I'm going to jump back into questions from our discussion, Justin, and then we'll get back to audience questions in a little bit. But next, I'd like to talk about why is learning at scale such a challenge for schools and universities, and what models of education or learning at scale do you find most intriguing?
So in the book, I define learning at scale as learning environments with many, many students and few experts to guide them. And when we can get these kinds of things to work, they're really great because lots of learning happens, efficiently and sometimes with a lot of fun and sometimes, at low costs and those kinds of things. Almost all of you listening here are probably members of a learning at scale community in some kind of way. If you like, watching and sharing makeup tutorials or hairstyling tutorials, if you like, learning about new recipes and sharing your cooking, if you take pictures of meals you cook and you share them with your friends on Facebook afterwards, if you play video games and you're trying to figure out how to beat new levels or change your character and you're reading Reddit posts and wikis and things like that, you're part of these learning at scale communities. And the challenges of using them are different in different fields and different subject areas, I try sort of throughout the book to shape the contour of some of these challenges. But three of the ways that I summarize them are that educational systems are incredibly complex. And so what works for 7th grade earth science doesn't work for 3rd grade Arabic, doesn't work for, year 16 machine learning and computer science. So we have this like really complex terrain. Our technologies are uneven. So they are sort of good for certain kinds of things in parts of subject areas, and for certain kinds of people in certain contexts. One specific example I bring up is that probably our very best automated assessments are computer programs that can grade other people's computer programs. So lots of CS courses will say, Chris, go ahead and write a computer program, submit it to this engine, and it'll give you some feedback about whether or not you've solved the engineering challenge, how parsimonious your program is, how well you've aligned to the style guidelines. And we can ask you to do some pretty complex programming tasks and then give you some feedback about how well you've done them. But there's a colleague of mine at MIT named Hal Abelson, who wrote a famous book about software program where he said, that actually software programming languages, code, is a way for human beings to communicate to other human beings about methodology and then to incidentally be run by machines. In Hal's view, what software programming is communication between people that happens to let a machine work. And actually all of our automated programming tools really can't evaluate that level of software engineering at all. We can't look in and see if your code is well commented. We can't see if your functions and arguments are designed with a logical structure that other people will understand and be able to build on and make sense of and things like that. So even, and I bring that up, it's this point of unevenness. Like our assessments can do our very best assessments can do some kinds of things, but not others, within the same field. So complexity, unevenness, and then the third challenge is inequality. Is that overwhelmingly when we generate new education technologies, they disproportionately benefit the affluent. They benefit people with the financial, social, and technical capital to take advantage of new innovations. And as much as we hope that new technologies can democratize education, they probably in important ways accelerate rather than ameliorate inequality. So those are sort of three of the big challenges that are out there. And then certainly, the models that I get most excited about and most intriguing, I talked before about these three genres of instructor-guided, algorithm-guided, and peer-guided learning at scale. And I think anybody who reads the book will realize that my heart is with the peer-guided learning at scale folks who are building these network learning communities that empower people, that, nurture creativity, that create choice and things like that. But there are good things to do with all three genres of learning at scale. In most times, I'm not a huge fan of kind of automatic gamified math software, but you know what? Like when all of the schools shut down, it's pretty good that we have a bunch of like gamified K-5 math software. That's pretty good. It's certainly better for learning math than doing nothing. And so, that's compelling to me. And I think there are a lot of things that massive open online courses don't do well. But I think they are pretty good for already educated, already affluent professionals. And one group of professionals that I care a lot about are teachers, and who work in the public service. So I feel if I'm helping them learn, I'm bettering society in my own tiny little way. And so I feel pretty good about those kinds of models and how we're trying to improve those kinds of models. So, again, it's one of these questions which is like, I try to find all of them intriguing, and be critical of all of them, and to say, the real solution is not saying there's like one right way to do education technology. The thing to say is to ask the question, like, how is the technology that we're looking at or working on going to fit in some kind of particular niche in some kind of way? And part of what really I'm trying to do with the book is to encourage people who study learning at scale from different perspectives to say, hey, there's some challenges that we all have in common. And if we talked about these challenges in a common language, we might be able to see, what kinds of things we're learning about democratizing education in Scratch that could be applied to cognitive tutors or vice versa.
That makes a lot of sense. And we're getting lots of good questions, Justin. You addressed, I think, one of the questions I had coming up for you. So I'm just going to go right to our audience because I think they're here to ask some really good questions. And I'm going to jump to Linda Wanless asked the question. She asked, what is the best approach to making sure the technology truly does match with the learning goals and the pedagogical approach without getting lost in the bells and whistles of the technology?
That's great. So that's a question about evaluating the technology. Like, how can we tell whether or not it's working the way that we want it to work?
It sounds like it.
Yeah. How do I encourage people to think about that? I mean, in our own group, some of the things that we do, we call the exercise construct definition, but there's lots of other things that you could do. Is when we try to think about what is our learning goal. Can we articulate clearly what we want students to be able to do? Another way we ask that question is, can we describe to you what it looks like when an expert is doing that thing well? Can we have a clear definition of our mind of what expertise looks like? And then can we describe for ourselves a pathway that help people get to expertise? And then we start, thinking about technologies that might help us along that pathway. Whenever we can, we try to test those ideas lightly. So I'm a big fan of places that do pilot programs that have little skunk works, that sort of, try this in the third grade, try this in the science department, like see if people stick with this and really use it, and it sort of gets better outcomes. And then, and then in terms of not getting lost in the bells and whistles or the pipes and guts of technology, I think, the only thing that I've found helpful to do that is to just like build communities where people remind each other all the time, what's the learning goal here and what is it that we want students to be able to do. One group of folks that can actually help you with that quite a bit are students. I think we, in all kinds of places in our schools, we dramatically underutilize the people who are most affected by these kinds of decisions. And over again in my career, I found that if you promise students that you will take their ideas seriously, they will work seriously in partnership with you and they will give you good ideas. I mean, I think this is particularly poignant now during the pandemic. There's exactly one generation of American students that have studied online during the pandemic. And it was the students who were in our classes last spring and in our classes this fall. And, we should be asking them all the time, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, what's working for you now, how can we make this better? As much as possible, we should try to have our classes be built in partnership with our students and not just presented to them.
I like that approach. And you talk a lot about, in your text, what I'll refer to as the tinkering mindset, which I think is always one that I've been an advocate for, of experimenting, as you mentioned, on small scale and working with your students, because they're just as much into tinkering as the next. I'm going to jump to another question here because I want to be cognizant of our time, because I think we could have this conversation for multiple hours. Jim, I'm going to say Jim Stouffer is asking, you briefly mentioned authentic learning that takes place outside the LMS. Can you say more about that and give examples of how the LMS, which is the center of our online classes, can link to learning outside of it?
Good. So I would say the starting point of that is that your learning management system is the logistical hub of your courses, but don't think of you and your students as living within that logistical hub. We all are embodied. We live in particular places in particular times with particular people. Like I'm currently sitting in my garage in the midst of a pandemic, and we might be communicating with my students through a learning management system. But again, all these things will be different in different fields. So I teach people who are teachers. I teach them things like how to, make progress towards competency-based education systems. Or the last course that we did was how to develop equity teaching practices, anti-racist teaching practices, and build them in your classroom. The course that we just launched, if you want to do a course with us on edX, we have one with Sam Weinberg from Stanford called Sorting Truth from Fiction, Civic Online Reasoning. And it's about helping students learn the skills of searching the web effectively and sorting truth from fiction, which most of us, it turns out, we're either not taught how to do or taught how to do the wrong way. So our goal in that class is that teachers leave our edX learning management system and they go back into their classrooms and they teach new things to their students. And so from the very beginning of our learning experiences together, we ask people to, in the first week, try this set of assessments with your students and see what kinds of response you get. And then bring your insights from that conversation out in the real world back into our discussion forum, usually through some kind of artifact. But we're, that is really the sort of central loop. It's like, come together in this space to do something very particular, and then go back out into the world and engage with the world in some way and bring some artifact of that engagement back into the classroom, and obviously that'll look different in science. But there are, ways that kids can be doing at-home experiments or even just at-home problem sets, thinking like, okay, so you're going to go and you're going to read a novel outside and you're going to write about it on a piece of paper and think about it and draw about it. And then you're going to take some artifact of that experience and bring it back. And then I have to find some other way to test, I wanted you to read this literature because I wanted you to look at the world anew in some way. Like, how am I going to find a way outside of this learning management system to ask you to look at the world anew again, and to have you do that practice and then bring some artifact of that practice back into our online conversation. So for us, the way we think about that challenge is by making sure that our learning management system, it's a logistical hub, but it's also a bus station. It's meant to just keep sending you back out. And then you create some kind of artifact from your experiences beyond us and bring that back into what we're doing.
That makes sense. Well, I've got a couple more questions for you, and then we'll wrap up with questions from our audience. But I've seen this pop up in the Q&A as well, and I thought this would be an appropriate time to turn here as well. So in what ways can we design learning technologies that ameliorate rather than exacerbate these opportunity gaps? And you also talk about the digital fault lines as opposed to the digital divide, which I think is an interesting analogy as well. So what kinds of approaches and or strategies can reliably address these new gaps along these fault lines?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that has been a central part of my research career. I have often found it enlightening, if often frustrating and sad, to regularly ask the question, how do people from different backgrounds and different life circumstances experience technology differently? And we have very good research that goes back a long time about this. One of the seminal pieces for me was written by a sociologist named Paul Atwell, who defined the two digital divides. He said the digital divide we often focus on is the digital divide of access. Who's got the fastest broadband, who has devices, who can connect with people, that's important. But a second digital divide is the digital divide of usage. So even if we networked every student across the country, one of the things that we're seeing right now is that young students' participation in Zoom school is being mediated by the behavioral expectations of their teachers. And we're finding all of these rules about you have to wear shoes on your Zoom call. You're not allowed to eat on your Zoom call. You have to have your camera on your Zoom call. Punishments are being being meted out for violating these various things. And I'm sure that we're going to find afterwards that Black students are far more likely to have these punishments enacted upon them for the same or milder infractions than white students. There's all kinds of evidence this happens in physical schools. So this is an example of the sort of digital divide of usage. Because of the way these behavioral criteria, these disciplinary criteria are applied, we're going to find that in many cases, Black and Latino and Native American students have less access to healthy learning experience and video conferencing, live education than white students do. And these kinds of digital divides of usage show up in all kinds of data in all kinds of different ways. So there's a paper that Mimi Ito and I wrote called From Good Intentions to Real Outcomes, Equity by Design in Learning Technology. And I kind of adapt that chapter in the book. I call it the Edtech Matthew Effect. And I have to say, Chris, that the problem is understood far better than the solutions are. So I think you'll find in the chapter or in the paper I wrote with Mimi, pretty compelling evidence that this pattern shows up over and over again. It's really hard to manage. We know a lot less about how to fix it. Which is, actually sort of a recurring theme. The second half of the book I describe as a series of as yet intractable dilemmas. If we knew how to do these things, we would do them. Some of the ideas that we have for developing technologies that address these gaps, one of them we say is to unite around shared purpose and to be suspicious of social distance. It's often the case that the people who have the power and privilege to develop learning technologies are not very socially close to the most vulnerable learners who are using these technologies. So we have a bunch of, particularly in the developing engineering roles, a lot of people from affluent backgrounds, a lot of people from elite schools, a lot of white and Asian men in software development roles. None of this is universal, of course. There's all kinds of people who do all kinds of things. But the profile of people who are developing, who are funding, who are leading ed tech companies, in many cases looks very different than the kinds of students who are using them. So we need to develop systems that reduce that social distance. I think there's a lot to be thought about in terms of seeing students not just as the sort of end community, sort of end user of interest, but to see communities as the targets of our learning. If it takes a village to raise a child, what would it look like to build learning software that sort of engaged and built capacity around the whole village? I have a colleague at UC Boulder, Rika Rose Roque, who does really cool work with family creative learning that comes out of her research that a lot of young people who find success using the Scratch programming language have parents who have some kind of connection to computer science or mechanical engineering or something like that. And so she says, well, okay, then in order for more students to be successful in Scratch, we need to help their parents and family members also understand Scratch and creative learning and things like that. So she partners with Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCAs and other things like that to create learning experiences, not just for students, but for their whole families. We think a lot of tools, and this gets into sort of dangerous territory, but one approach is to do more work measuring the experiences of people and their learning outcomes by subgroup. So we need to figure out whether our students are more or less affluent, whether they're white or Black or from another racial group, whether they have other kinds of vulnerabilities that we're not aware of, or that we could be aware of if we asked, or if we got that information. And then we need to evaluate how people from different life circumstances use and benefit or not from our technologies. A bunch of my research does that, and I like to think it's made some important contributions, showing around massive open online courses, that the people who register for Harvard X and MIT X courses in the United States live in neighborhoods on average that are half standard deviation more affluent than typical Americans. But in order to do that kind of research, there's ways that we turn learning technologies into these sort of giant surveillance apparatus. And as a public, we should be very, very cautious of schools, of especially private for-profit organizations that are collecting vast amounts of data about us. And we need a better social contract to do that more responsibly. But it's very difficult to ameliorate opportunity gaps if we're not measuring them.
A very solid point there. I've got one more question for you, and then I'm going to pop over to the audience to wrap us up for the day. The current pandemic has ushered in changes to the way people teach and the way we learn now. What about this new world intrigues you, and what about it concerns you the most?
So I think there are not very many silver linings. I think this is generally bad. I've done a lot of press interviews and stuff like that, and people are always trying to sort of eke out of me well, what might be good here? And I'm like, it's pretty much bad. Pandemic's pretty bad. A lot of people are dead. A lot of learning not happening. But I will say the thing that I think intrigues me, there are a few things. One is youth, as they always do, are showing tremendous resilience, tremendous strength. And I think, even the students who are not learning, as much about the Pythagorean theorem and the three branches of government and iambic pentameter as we might hope they would in a typical year. They are learning about using new technologies, and they are learning skills and practices for independent learning, for self-directed learning. And I'm hopeful that those things will stay with them. I do think there are a bunch of people who have spent most of their lives in physical schools, a large number, but probably a small percentage of all people, who are discovering that online learning works pretty well for them, and that they will do more of it. We've certainly heard from, folks from marginalized communities, Black youth, Latino youth, who go to schools and they experience bigotry and racism every day. And now they're studying at home from the loving arms of their families. And they're like, hey, this is pretty good. I'm kind of liking this online learning thing. But overwhelmingly, what we have seen is that the most vulnerable members of our society are least capable of participating, are least well supported in participating in different forms of remote learning. And we have both, the pandemic has both exposed tremendous inequalities in our society and also dramatically exacerbated them. And that, I think, there are sort of two stories that we've told about online learning and its effects. And one of those stories comes from instructional designers who've done a bunch of small randomized controlled trials over many, many years, many of them. And they typically find what they call the no significant differences effect, that people in online or blended learning environments pretty much learn the same as people in face-to-face learning environments. But if you look really closely at those individual studies, you find that a lot of them are in medicine. Very few of them have to do with our youngest learners. Most of them are small. Most of them are too small to do any kind of analysis of subgroup differences. So a second story has emerged in the last 10 years, which posits that actually in real world circumstances, not sort of hothouse randomized controlled trials, but if you send tens of thousands of people into the Washington community college system, you'll find that there are a lot of learners who do less well online than we think they would if they had rolled in an on-person class. They've been characterized by a community college researcher in California as the online penalty. And there's a bunch of emerging research that suggests the online penalty is worst for our most vulnerable students. That people who would thrive in any kind of learning environment will do fine online. But people who are members of historically marginalized racial groups that haven't gotten the same level of educational support or educational experience in their career, people who are younger with less experience in certain fields, men and boys who don't do as well in schooling environments, they do less well online than they would have face-to-face. And so I think, it's probably the case that even the students who are reaching through our rickety online learning experiences, the most vulnerable, we're probably letting more of those most vulnerable students slip through our system than we would in a normal year. I'm enormously concerned about that. And one small thing that we can do to address this in the immediate moment, particularly in higher education, I think a lot of higher education takes a kind of sink or swim approach. Look, I just create these courses and people come to them, and if you do the work, you'll learn. And if you don't, that's on you. You're an adult, you choose. But I would hope that faculty across the country and across the world choose not to adopt that approach this year, and really think about how can we see our students as vulnerable people going through an enormous set of challenges in a period of world historical difficulty, and how can we do everything we can to reach out to our most vulnerable students and connect with them and find ways to support and nurture their success, and sort of stay away from that sink or swim kind of perspective.
That makes sense too. Thank you, Justin. We are got just a few minutes left, and I'm going to pop into the question and answer section, and I'm going to go to Ken Mellendorf, who's been very patient and asking lots of good questions. And there's one in particular that seems appropriate here. He says, I ask students what online lacks. The description of learning is this: information is from books and computers, understanding is from interacting with other students, confidence is from the presence of instructors to ask questions of whenever needed. If this model cannot be developed in online systems, can it be in some way simulated or redeveloped?
I think that's great. And I think that's a beautiful framing. And I love the idea of Ken starting from the question of like, well, what do students think of these things? And I think we should bring a lot of humility to the answer to that question and say, for lots of learners and lots of subjects, the answer is no. And the reason why we know that the answer is no is that we've had many, many smart people who have worked on these challenges from the very earliest days of computing. Since we've had computers the size of my little garage here, we've had computer scientists partnering with education scientists to create learning technologies. And again, here we are in a moment in which they were sort of needed more than ever. And the two sort of dominant technologies of the pandemic, they were not massive open online courses. They were not adaptive tutors. It wasn't data or AI or virtual reality. It was learning management systems, first theorized in the 60s and 70s and commercialized in the 90s and made open source in the 2000s. And a technology that we, in the 1930s, when it was first prototyped, we called video telephony or video conferencing. There has been an extraordinary conservatism pedagogically in response to the pandemic. And I think it's because the field of education technology hasn't built things that address the kinds of issues that Ken describes. We really don't have something that for most learner replaces the confidence in learning that comes from being in the presence of a caring expert. And it's not that we have nothing that's like that, but a lot of the things that we do have that are like that work best for our most affluent, most able, most already educated students. And the hard parts in education will remain hard. There's a whole bunch, along that sort of lines of mentoring. There's been a whole bunch of experiments over the last decade in college persistence, in saying, okay, some people have access to parents with experience enrolling in colleges. Some people have access to college counselors and others don't. So the people who don't, let's try to, have them participate in these like text messaging campaigns and other things that sort of remind them of FAFSA deadlines and other kinds of things like that. And for a while it looked like they worked a little bit and they were cheap. And then we found that actually, even when they work at getting people enrolled in schools, they don't work that well in getting people to persist. And so it's like, nope, you actually just need those really expensive human beings that are college counselors that pick up the phone and call people and make a human connection with them and help them persist in their post-secondary goals. And there may be technologies that we can develop that aid and support that relationship. But I think a bunch of those things for the foreseeable future, we just won't replace. And I really think the experience of the pandemic should chasten anyone who brings a kind of unrealistic optimism to what education technology can do, because we've seen the ways it has been used during the pandemic, and our most fanciful descriptions of what education technology could be for the most part have not come true.
Well, I appreciate that answer, and I apologize for those of you who asked some really terrific questions and we just didn't have a chance to get to. Justin, we're going to be shipping these questions to you, and you'll have an opportunity to answer them as well. I want to
They're all
thank
answered
you.
in the book, I bet. Just buy the book. That'll be
By them.
easier. Go to failuretodisrupt.com, buy the book. All your questions answered there.
I would argue you're pretty darn close.
Pretty close. The
So
other thing we have going on, Chris, is that we have a free book club that's starting on September 21st, 3 p.m. on Mondays, and also recorded. It's going to run 10 sessions, one session for each chapter of the book, and it's free, and anybody can sign up at failuretodisrupt.com/virtual book club.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure we include that information when we follow up with participants today. And again, Justin, I want to thank you for joining us today. Again, the book is available online at both at Amazon and at Harvard University Press, where you can get your copy today. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank everyone who also attended today. I'd like to add that at D2L, we believe that learning is the foundation upon which all progress and achievement rests, and we are always here to talk about how our Brightspace learning platform can help you support your institution's teaching and learning needs. So if you have any questions or want to connect with a product expert, please reach out to us at highered@d2l.com. Again, thank you for participating in our event. And as a quick reminder, this event was recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with you within the next few days. So thanks again. And thank you, Justin.
It's been a pleasure, Christopher. Thanks for having me.
All right.